All right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good
Good
afternoon.
afternoon.
Hello, hello, hello. All right.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
It's lunchtime. It's
Hi.
12:02. All right, good. Good. Well, I just wanted to open up this session here. Nick, I don't know what the official title of our cultural event is today, but I'm excited to have the opportunity again to do this lunch and learn and this cultural event as well. It's something that we continue to promote as a department and as a city to make sure that we are living up to all the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and equity more specifically for our department. And so, in order to do this, we have to lead in that regard, and by us doing so, we have to learn from each other. And these are great opportunities for us to take time away from our busy schedules to look at a greater context, so we make sure that we live up to our that DEI mantra. And so we've been doing a pretty good job and staying on the course over the past 18 months, even though through the pandemic and the like, to still keep our eyes focused on making sure we're leading the pathway around this. But I'm looking forward to this discussion today, and hopefully we get to learn from some of the content that's going to be presented as well. Moving forward for future cultural events, this is something that we still want to keep going on. Although I will be departing, and those of you probably have heard, I'm taking my talents to South Beach, more specifically Miami-Dade County, to be the director CEO of the Transportation and Public Works Department down there. So bittersweet for me departing, but my time here in Denver has been great. And part of it is because of all the employees that we have here, all the great initiatives that we've been focusing in on in the past several years, and this being one of the critical initiatives and activities that we've really been sponsoring and supporting for the past couple of years to bring us all together, right, as a department, and again to be the best and most ideal department in the country. And I think we're well on our way in achieving our goals. So one, I just wanted to take time out and appreciate everybody taking time out to participate in these types of events and to say goodbye. I'll still be around through the middle part of July, but probably will not be hearing from me or seeing from me a whole lot. So, but I will continue to keep my eyes on all the great things that the department is doing. So again, thank you very much for all the support and all your willingness to participate and be active and present when we talk around these kind of cultural activities and like moving forward. So with that being said, Nick, am I turning this back over to you?
I believe so. And I can
Okay.
introduce our presenters today. Thank goodness for mute buttons there. So today we are joined by two members of the Community Planning and Development Department. We have Kara Hahn and Becca Deershaw. Both are members of the Landmark Preservation Team, which help preserve, enhance, and encourage the use of structures and areas in the city with historical, architectural, and/or geographical significance, probably some stuff that we at DOTI either build or maintain. So Kara is a principal planner with the Landmark team. She oversees the Landmark Designation Program, works primarily on regulatory and planning projects. Regulatory is always my favorite. And Becca is an associate planner with Landmark Preservation. She does design and demolition review for the Landmark program and is a member of the West Area Neighborhood Planning Team. Today, Kara and Becca are going to be sharing a presentation entitled It's a Beautiful Day in the Gayborhood, Conceptualizing Queer Spaces in Denver's History. And like I said, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for our DOTI team to understand how the infrastructure that we create can become cultural touchstones. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kara and Becca. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. As you said, my name is Kara. My pronouns are she, her, and we will be giving a presentation as soon as Becca can share it. I know that Teams has just changed a little bit, so.
All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, we're advanced. But we should not be. Oh, no. Spoiler alert. Cover your eyes. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Great, thanks. So we wanted to talk about, it's a beautiful day in the Gayborhood, and really talk about queer spaces in Denver. As we talk through this presentation, we'll be using different terminology and language: LGBTQ, LGBTQAI, and queer. We both identify as queer, and we use the term queer to mean anything that is not cis, anyone who is not cis or straight. But we'll be using a variety of different language through this presentation. Becca and I have been working on this for about the last 5 years, off and on. We both have done research outside of our time with the city, but we've been really looking at, and we started mapping Denver's queer spaces. A lot of that started with looking at gay bars in Denver, because that's what people really associate with the LGBTQ community, but we also wanted to explore beyond that. What do spaces look beyond that? And so you'll see some maps as we go through here, and all of the dots that are on the maps represent different locations and spaces we found over time, represented by decade. I am going to attempt to request control, if Becca will let me, and we'll see how this works. Possibly. Becca, I'm just going to have you go ahead and forward the slide. Sorry.
Okay, you do have control, but
It wasn't letting me. There we go. Thank you. So we wanted to provide a little bit of historic context. We're historians, so we always think that a national context helps explain what's happening here in Denver. So we wanted to use a little bit of like what's happening nationwide. As you'll see at the top, we kind of divided this into decades. No history can be told in a linear path, and Becca will go into that a little bit more, but we did group these a little bit by decade. And so we start with basically pre-Stonewall history. And you really start looking, starting in World War II, the military had a ban on gay and lesbians serving in the military. You had President Eisenhower issuing an executive order for the dismissal of all gay and lesbian members of the federal government. And so you start seeing a lot of, oppressive operations from the government, but you also start seeing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s small amounts of and the LGBTQ community coming forward, fighting for gay rights. And you see some of it from the community itself and from other institutions as well, like the Kinsey Report, which was one of the first reports that studied human sexuality, looking at diversity in sexual orientation. You also see in the 1950s the start of the Mattachine Society, and so that is the group that is the earliest gay rights movement in the country. And the Mattachine Society, if you see on the lower left-hand side there, everyone's in suits and ties. And with any civil rights movements, you're going to see a diversity of the types and the people who are in it. And some are looking to be very proper. We are just like everybody else. And then you're going to see more radical sides as well. And no movement is unified. And the gay rights movement is, similar to others like that. And the Mattachine Society was only for men. There was a lot of still sexism and racism within the gay rights movement. And so when they were founded in 1950, it was for proper white men to show that there is, the gays and lesbians are just like everybody else, or just gays are just like everybody else. And so in the 1955, Daughters of Bilitis, which is a queer women's group, started in San Francisco. And you start seeing on each of the coasts, mainly in New York, LA, and San Francisco, you start seeing a lot of gay rights movements and organizations starting there. And throughout the history of the gay rights movement, you're going to see that that's where the primary areas of really large concentration of activists are. However, Denver and Chicago, in terms of the interior of the country, you also start seeing some more organizations and more organizations founded. And so in the 1940s and 50s, while there was a lot of oppression from the federal government, you did start to see some movement. In 1958, as you see on the blue one image there. In 1958, the Supreme Court ruled that free speech extends to the gay press. So that was one of the first times you started seeing the federal government saying and allowing for gay rights to be seen and allowing for some level of free press for the gay rights community. Here in Denver, as you look at the timeline, anything that has a little asterisk on it reflects Colorado or Denver history. So the Mattachine Society that was really focused on each of the coasts did actually have some annual meetings on the interior of the country, like I said, in Chicago and Denver. And in 1959, they held their annual meeting here at the Albany Hotel in Denver. That was on the corner of 17th and Stout. It has since been demolished. But this was a meeting to talk about, what can we do to promote gay rights? Unfortunately, at this particular meeting, the roster of individuals who participated in it was released. It came into the press, and so while a lot of the people who participated in Denver used pseudonyms, not all of them did, and there was a backlash against Denver's queer community. People were fired, people were released from their jobs, people were highly discriminated against. And this act in 1959 really pushed Denver's queer society further underground. And it didn't really move forward for another decade or so. Becca, if you could forward that. In sort of still the pre-Stonewall era, we start to see in the 1960s the civil rights movement moving forward, and you see a lot of firsts. You see in San Francisco the first openly gay person run for office. You see The Advocate, which is an LGBTQ magazine published for the first time. You had some of the first gay rights demonstrations. In the center, you see an image from Life magazine that talked about homosexuality in America. And it wasn't necessarily a particularly flattering expose or story, but it really was one of the first times that people were seeing themselves in print in a national magazine. And so when you look at interviews and you talk to people from the queer community in the 60s, this was the first time that they really began to see someone who looked like themselves outside of really small niche areas. And then at the end, as you look here in the 1969, you see two images. You see an image of Frank Kameny holding a sign that gay is good, and he's dressed in his very proper attire. He was one of the founders of the Mattachine Society. And on the bottom, you see a newspaper article that was reflective of what happened at Stonewall. And I think it's important to remember that we talk about Stonewall now and Stonewall Inn as a national monument, but it really started as a riot. And the Stonewall riots started in 1969, June 28th. Stonewall was a gay bar, and the New York police kept raiding it. And some of the patrons decided they were just done with it. They were done with the police coming in simply because they were in a queer space and being arrested for it. And one of the things that we think is really important to remember, that those who first started the Stonewall riots were Black, drag queens, trans women, and sex workers. And it's important that when we talk about the start of the LGBTQ community, to remember who really started the Stonewall uprisings. And they ended up throwing bricks at the police over a series of nights. And it really it led to a national movement. Becca, if you could forward. And so what we see here in Colorado and in Denver are not a lot of spots in sort of the pre-Stonewall. There are a few spaces, and you see on each of these individual dots are bars that we located in things we were able to find where there were queer spaces in Denver. And they were in a lot of older historic buildings. The Ship's Tavern Bar in the Brown Palace was known to be a space where queer people would gather. But we were seeing just a lot of older historic buildings, but in sort of at the time in the 1960s, a seedier downtown, which was one of the only spaces for queer people to gather. Back, good forward. And as you move into the 1970s, after Stonewall, we talk about this sort of being a fighting time for the queer community. And it's basically a fighting for basic human rights, which was basically a need to not be harassed by the police and the government. And you start to see some parades actually in marches bookend each parts of the decade. So in June of 1970, the queer community in New York City held the Christopher Street March, which was to commemorate the Stonewall riots. And then at the end of the decade, it wasn't just New York that was marching, but there was a march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. As we were sort of fighting for our right to exist and our right to gather and live in community and spaces. You saw during this time the first LGBTQ openly gay person was elected to office. Harvey Milk was elected as a supervisor in San Francisco, which is basically the equivalent of Denver City Council. Unfortunately, he was elected in 77, and by 78, he was assassinated by a fellow member, a fellow supervisor. You also saw some things occurring here in Denver. In 1975, the Boulder County Clerk issued 6 same-sex marriage licenses. And a lot of the members, or a lot of the couples who were issued the marriage licenses actually came down to Denver and were married at the First Unitarian Society Church on 14th and Lafayette. And so you had some of the very first, not the very first, but some of the very first LGBTQ marriages in the country happened here in Denver. They were, unfortunately, the marriage licenses were revoked once people discovered that the clerk in Boulder had been issuing them. We also see in the early 1970s, the first time that the queer community in Denver starts to come together and coalesce since the 1959 meeting where they had been outed in the newspaper. And so this is one of the first times that we see them come forward. And it is in the known as the Johnny Cash Special bus. Becca, if you can forward on. So as you're looking here, we see a couple of cruising grounds for LGBTQ community members. So we talked about how there were a lot of bars where people were meeting, but we also look at our park spaces as where a lot of gay men were meeting in terms of cruising grounds. And so we look at these spaces now as really, civic places, but they were used for a variety of different activities. And if you look here at Cheeseman Park, it looks a little bit different than what we see today. There used to be bathrooms underneath the pavilions, and you can see a little bit of some of the entrances that were there. And because it became a meeting space for gay men, eventually they were infilled. And so the park system that we see today in Cheeseman Park looks radically different than it did in the 1960s and 1970s because it became known as a spot for cruising grounds. The same thing can be said for Civic Center and a lot of the spaces behind the Capitol. When the police discovered this, they set up an entrapment for the queer community. One of the things that was interesting is that the Colorado state statute and the Denver ordinances were in conflict with each other. What was allowed under Colorado statute was not allowed under Denver ordinance. And so Denver had written an ordinance against lewd behavior, written basically entirely against the queer community and against gay men. And it was interpreted by Denver police and by the district attorney's office as even any level of discussion or holding hands, anything like that could be determined as lewd behavior. And so the police used entrapment. They had a bus. It said the Johnny Cash Special. Undercover vice police officers would try to pick up gay men through telling them what they could or could not do and try to get it through language, what would be occurring on the grounds. They would then arrest the police or arrest the gay men and put them into the back of the bus. And they did this over and over and over again until the bus was full, and they take all of the gay men off to jail for discussing the possibility of having sex. There was nothing actually occurred, but just the discussion, just talking about queer sex was interpreted by the Denver police as lewd behavior and was something that you could be arrested for. And so this ongoing behavior by the police really brought forward what became known as the Gay Coalition of Denver. And so it was a gay rights movement, and it was really a few different individuals who came forward, one of whom was an attorney, Gary Grash, or Gerald or Gary. And so they found, or he found, because there was this conflict between the state statute and the Denver ordinance, that they could sue Denver for its ordinance. And this ended up going all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court. And it's one of the reasons that we actually have a lot of data of what was occurring, simply because it was a Supreme Court case. Also, one of the early members of the Gay Coalition of Denver was an archivist for the Colorado Historical Society, which is now History Colorado. And so he preserved every pamphlet, every letter that was ever written in the 1960s and 70s. And so we have we in Denver are really lucky to have this great archival record of some of the history of what the Gay Coalition of Denver was doing. On the right, you see an image of pamphlets they were putting out to help protect the gay community because they were being entrapped, and what you did and did not have to do if you were arrested, how to protect yourself from the police, what you had to tell. You did not have to tell where you worked. You didn't have to out yourself to your employer. And so the Gay Coalition of Denver was really instrumental in providing information to the queer community about how to survive police brutality. During this time, it really led to sort of a coalescing of the movement. And then they started not only to take it to the Supreme Court case, the Colorado Supreme Court, but they also took it to Denver City Council to try and get these ordinances changed. It's great that there's this great archival record, but it's actually heartbreakingly sad as I was researching and looking at it, at the lengths that Denver City Council went to avoid meeting with, talking, or recognizing anyone within the queer community. And so as the Gay Coalition of Denver attempted to change ordinances about how the police treated our community, they would avoid calls, they would avoid letters. They'd finally say, okay, you're assigned to this committee, we'll finally have a meeting with you. And the day before the meeting, they'd say, oh no, we've changed that to a new committee. You now have to talk to a new council member and go through the process. And this was a years-long process to even be heard by Denver City Council. And eventually, on October 23rd, 1973, Denver City Council finally held a public hearing on this ordinance and its interpretation of lewd behavior by the queer community. And it was finally at this point that the queer community came out in public. And as you can see from these images, it was a packed house in the Denver City Council chambers, as well as all of the hallways were packed. And it was one of the first times that you had both gay men and lesbians showing up to fight for our right to just simply live and exist. It was initially at Denver City Council only going to be a really short, they were going to provide 15 minutes of public comment. And two Denver City Council members came forward and said, no, these people deserve to be heard. They were the two city council members, one was African American and one was Jewish, who finally said members of the queer community should be heard. And over that 2-hour public hearing, it began to actually change some minds. And out of this public hearing came a change from the ordinance. And it's known now in Denver as the Gay Revolt. And this actually became it made national news. And Becca, if you can advance the slide, there was a bathhouse owner from San Francisco who came to Denver and came to that public hearing. And afterwards, he handed the leaders of the Gay Coalition of Denver a roll of cash and said, do something good with this. And so you had the Gay Coalition of Denver, which had been meeting here in this Cap Hill apartment. They were able to actually find a space that could be open to the public year-round at all hours, and not just someone's apartment. Becca, if you'd like to advance that. And so in 1973, the Gay Coalition was able to open In this building on the top right, the red sandstone, in the Cap Hill area, and they were able to open the first Gay Coalition of Denver space for the queer community to meet. There was a library, they offered meeting spaces, they offered ways to help people, you know, pay rent and, you know, how do you find spaces? And over time, that the Gay Coalition evolved. It went from the Gay Coalition of Denver to the Gay Community Center of Colorado, and it moved to the image here on the bottom right. And if you can see sort of on the far right of that image is the First Unitarian Society of Denver. It was property owned by them. This is where those marriages were first done in the 1960s, in the 1970s. It became the center for the Gay Community Center. It then moved to the Gay and Lesbian Community Center and has morphed now into what we know as the Center on Colfax. All of these spaces are all within a few blocks of each other. And so as we've been looking at these maps and we've been seeing all of these spaces inside of gay bars, we really began to see as we were looking at this and studying it that it wasn't just a place of bars. That the gay community, yes, that's what everyone's known. That's what the gay community is really known for. This is where we are known to meet. But really, we found as we were studying this that it was really the Cap Hill neighborhood became basically the Gayborhood. And we started seeing it wasn't just bars, but it was places in community. And because Cap Hill in the 70s was, again, a little dodgy, it's where the queer community could afford to find housing. And so as we have looked at our studies, we've moved just from looking at bars, and we wanted to look and really look at other areas of the queer community life, and found that Cap Hill is really the Gayborhood. It's something we all knew. There were 3 of us who have been studying this over time. And we all sort of 3 generations of queer women, and we all met in Cheeseman Park, and we were looking at it, and it was a really kind of a moving time for us as we looked at it, as we all experienced Cheeseman Park in different ways, as 3 different queer women in different decades have experienced Cheeseman Park as, you know, really the home of the queer community. And so we found that this was our community space. In the 1980s, we really needed that community space because it became really about survival. It became about surviving AIDS. There were other firsts that happened. There are other, you know, you saw some major figures coming out or being forced out of the closet. Billie Jean King came out, and not really came out, but was forced out by her ex-partner. Rock Hudson came out. You saw Barney Frank, who was a representative from Massachusetts. He came out, but you ended up with the National Coming Out Days. But really, it was about the gay community coming together to survive the AIDS crisis. The Colorado AIDS Project was founded in 1984. And while there had been this division between gay men and lesbians, it was really during the 1980s that it brought the community together as queer women helped take care of the gay men who were dying from AIDS. And you can see that in some of the, you know, there are still some of these bars and locations, but there were fewer of them because there was fewer members of the community. But you can see that there were things like the Foxhole or BJ's Carousel that were locations for the gay community and for lesbian bars that were founded. If you look at the image in the upper right, you can see that it's sort of everything is obscured. It's not well advertised. It was intentional that people didn't know where this was. You had to be in the know to go because it was still unsafe to come to, you know, for you to be too out or into the open. There were still, but even with that, there were a few things that were happening that were good, that even though we're living through the AIDS crisis, we started seeing that the Pride March became the Pride Parade. And so you had Stonewall on June 28th, 1969. And then in 1970, you had the St. Christopher Day's March. Those marches turned from St. Christopher's Day to just a Pride March. And then over time, that Pride March has become a Pride Parade. And now the month of June is just basically, it's just Pride. And we are coming up here on this weekend as Denver's Pride. And it's always tends to be towards the end of the month of June in commemoration of the Stonewall riots. And during the 1980s, this went from just a march to a more family-oriented Pride Parade. But there still wasn't, there were still a lot of protesters that were out. As you can see there in the middle, there were people who were anti-gay protesters that were protesting the Pride Parade. We very much enjoy the picture on the right, which is someone who is protesting the anti-gay protester and ripping up their homophobic sign that they were holding up. And so there were moments of celebration within the community, even during the AIDS crisis. And we also wanted to talk a little bit about things beyond just the bars that we have. That during this time, there was a growth of social and philanthropic organizations. A lot of it was to raise money for AIDS-related charities. So you had the Imperial Court of the Rocky Mountain Empire, which was a drag community. And so they would hold drag events in order to raise money. You had a lot of music theater and LGBTQ community coming forward in theater and music. You had the Colorado Gay Rodeo Association was formed in 1983, and all the proceeds for anything that they did went to help fight AIDS. And so you saw this growth of social organizations outside of the bars in a way to help coalesce and help survive the AIDS crisis. But that doesn't mean all the bars went away. Here are some images of a couple of different bars here in Denver. That, as you can see, it's side entrances. Things are kind of covered. The image on the left with the detour and the rainbow flag there wasn't necessarily shown in 1983. By 2009, you might have started to see a little more public displays. And I'll end here on the next slide and pass it off to Becca to look at the R&R Bar, which is the longest running gay bar that we can find in Denver. It didn't used to always have the painted sign that has the LGBTQ colors, the sort of rainbow colors on the door. It's still had sort of a small entrance. The windows were a little bit small, but now over time you can see that it's a queer space. And so this is an important institution along Colfax that is the longest running gay bar that we can find in Denver that has been documented. And so while that is not a Denver landmark, I think Becca and I would advocate that if they ever wanted to become a Denver landmark, we would love to work with them to do that, to show its long running history in Denver. And I'm going to pass this off to Becca to talk for the rest of the time.
All right, thank you, Kara. And I'm Becca, also she, her pronouns. So let's get into the 90s. In the 1990s, gay culture went mainstream. 1991 saw the first gay kiss on television on A&E's LA Law. The movie Philadelphia, which earned Tom Hanks an Oscar for his portrayal of a lawyer suffering from AIDS, was released in 1993. And in 1997, Ellen DeGeneres came out on national TV. But even as gay culture entered the popular media, gay issues were rising in prominence in other areas, especially here in Colorado. And of course, it was not straightforward progress because as we've shown so far, history never is just straightforward. So we're calling the 1990s mainstreaming, but the decade occupied an uncomfortable space, with the cause moving forward in media and pop culture, but being challenged in the civil arena. In 1992, Amendment 2 was passed by Colorado voters with 53% of the vote. And this law prohibited any city or jurisdiction in the state of Colorado from enacting laws that recognize sexual orientation as a protected class. The passage of Amendment 2 made national news, and in Denver, many in the queer community were shocked that it was passed. In fact, they even held a vigil on the state's, the Capitol steps afterwards in mourning for this law passing. It was widely thought that it had been voted down, so it was a surprise to many people that it passed. The law was immediately challenged in court, and in 1996, the Supreme Court struck down the law for denying gays and lesbians equal protection under the law. Here in Denver, we still see that there are a lot of safe spaces required for the queer community. And I particularly want to focus on the growth of women's spaces in Denver, especially the feminist bookstore. In the 1980s, spaces for lesbians were growing, but outside of a few bars and the outskirts of town, these places weren't really permanent spots. They were pretty transient. But as we saw in the 1990s, many lesbian groups, comedy acts, open mic nights, they met in church basements, homes, or had one night a week dedicated to being a lesbian space. One such church was the First Unitarian Church at 14th and Lafayette that we've sort of been talking a lot about in this presentation. Today, this building is a locally designated landmark, in part due to its association with the gay community in Denver. And it's actually our first such landmark. So we're pretty proud of it. The First Unitarian Society hosted monthly Any Women's Coffee House hours as a way to offer a welcoming space for lesbians to meet in spaces outside of bars. And these events were critical for shaping the lesbian experience in Denver. This feminist collective ideal stretches back into the 1970s, or really the 1870s, if you want to go even further back. But as we move into the 1990s, these groups moved out of temporary spaces and into more dedicated digs, including the iconic and now endangered feminist bookstore. So early iterations of the feminist bookstore in Denver included woman-to-woman bookstore in the historic Letonia apartments on Colfax, right next to the new Illegal Pete's, and where I once lived, which was pretty exciting for me. And then also Category 6 books, which served both men and women. But perhaps the longest running women's bookstore in Denver was the Book Garden, which operated from 1985 through 2004 in the Congress Park neighborhood. The Book Garden was deliberately created as a space for all women, whether they identified as lesbian, bisexual, or trans. And in the wake of Amendment 2's passage, the bookstore served as an important role in providing a safe space for queer women while supporting and promoting women authors and artists. The Book Garden carried a wide variety of books, from tomes on feminist theory to mystery novels, which were the bestseller, and groundbreaking works on gender and sexuality. This dedicated women's space survived through the early 2000s, but as we'll see, the mainstreaming of queer culture often led to the closure of many longtime devoted queer spaces. As we move into more recent history, 2000 through the present, we're calling it solidifying. While the 90s saw gay figures entering mainstream space through TV, news, and other popular media, the 2000s moved beyond the screens and into the real world, so to speak. It became normalized to have a gay friend or coworker. And in addition to that, landmark legislation and court rulings began to legitimize queer relationships in the civil arena, beginning with Massachusetts in 2003 and culminating in the Supreme Court ruling in 2015 that made marriage equality the law of the land. Of course, civil rights don't begin and end with marriage, but it was definitely a culturally defining moment. So as we saw in the late 90s, queer spaces became increasingly open to many different groups. This perhaps hastened the decline of the gay bar in Denver. From our maps, we see that the number of bars and other spaces seemed to peak in the 1970s, but by the early 2000s, the numbers had dropped precipitously. When we look at the map of spaces in the early 2000s, we see clusters of venues opening on South Broadway, which in the early 2000s was still a kind of gritty place to be. The Baker neighborhood directly west was actively gentrifying, and often gay families were at the forefront of that popularity. We also see spaces continue active in the Gayborhood, but also there was a move up the river. At the time, this area in Five Points was little more than abandoned warehouses, but we all know it today as Rhino and is one of the hippest spots to be. I also want to point out a spot way up in Commerce City up here, which was Tequila Rosas, which was one of the few Latino spaces in Denver that we found, and definitely is an area that needs more research, though maybe not by two white women. So as we move into the present decade, well, I guess it's not the present decade anymore, into 2010s, we see that the spaces have really spread out across the city. South Broadway and Uptown are still popular, but we have joints out in River North and down south in Glendale, of all places. And so while on one hand, we mourn this loss of some of our most long-standing queer spaces and the ever-constricting band of gay juke joints, it signals a wider cultural shift taking place in Colorado. We termed this decade solidifying because it was in the 2000s that queer culture became a recognized normal part of life. And a good example of that is through our politics. So in the 2000s, we see a dramatic uptick in politicians who are out in their public life, basically from the day they run for office. People like Mark Ferrandino, Pat Stedman, and Jennifer Vega used their political offices to advocate for gay civil liberties. In 2006, which was the first election I could ever vote in here in my life, the Colorado legislature sent referendum I to state voters. And I was really excited to vote for referendum I. It would have established domestic partnerships in the state of Colorado. Unfortunately, voters not only voted down the referendum, they simultaneously amended the Colorado Constitution to define marriage as being between one man and one woman. Many of our state legislators were not deterred. In 2011, Pat Stedman and Mark Ferrandino introduced the Colorado Civil Unions Act, which would have allowed all couples, gay and straight, to give a civil union. While the bill passed the Senate, it never made it to the House floor and died in committee. In 2012, Stedman and Ferrandino returned and were again denied, but third time's the charm. In 2013, the Civil Unions Bill was once again proposed, and this time it passed, allowing the state to recognize civil unions. And it was signed by Governor Hickenlooper in the new History Colorado Center. At the same time, we see that queer spaces are changing quite dramatically as we start to approach the present day. Our maps have shown that while Denver's gay spaces have not always been on the physical periphery of the city, they certainly have found safety in the less desirable parts of the city. Areas that maybe once have been respectable but have lost their status as people moved out of the city center, or industrial areas that were never viewed as recreational spaces. Here, however, as the Denver economy has boomed, redevelopment has pushed many of these establishments out of their historic locations. And interestingly, as the gay community has become more accepted, many bars are finding new homes closer to the hotspots of Denver and welcoming the embrace of the Gayborhood once more. And this time they're attracting a diverse clientele of both gay and straight patrons. Alternatively, many of the bars are finding that they cannot survive. Patrons now have many choices and may not need to seek out designated safe space. So the Eagle is one good example of this shift. Located at 36th and Blake Street, the Eagle occupied a nondescript 1960s precast concrete industrial building. The bar lost its lease in 2016, not from discrimination, but because of the pressures of redevelopment. The Eagle and several other small buildings nearby were removed to make way for a 7-story mixed-use building as part of the Rhino 38th and Blake redevelopment. The Eagle was definitely not the first of these gay spaces in Rhino to be demolished and to be removed due to the pressures of redevelopment. On Fox Street, there were 3 LGBT bars and dance clubs, the Foxhole, Trax, and Proteus. In the 1980s, these bars occupied the hub of the queer nightlife in Denver. Patrons would start at one location, and through the course of the night or the weekend, they would try and visit all 3 locations. The area is tucked behind Coors Field, I-25, and abandoned train tracks, but it's since become prime for redevelopment. One by one, all of these spaces were sold and turned down, and they've been redeveloped into mixed use and luxury apartments. To this day, only Trax survives, and Tracks survived by moving to another location, another underutilized location in Rhino. It moved into an abandoned warehouse and has remained popular ever since, and has since grown to occupy the entire building. So similar to other locations that other bars that started in the early 2000s, today Tracks makes no attempt to hide its nature. The story-and-a-half building retains its original steel casement windows on both the street-facing and alley facades. And during the holy days of obligation, Pride, Halloween, and New Year's, the entrances are decorated extravagantly into a themed party event. The alley has also become an extension of the venue itself and is heavily decorated, serving as additional space to be utilized rather than, a seedy back area where you go to not be seen. So Tracks and Exto have nestled themselves in the redevelopment of the Rhino area. Exto is rented out on weekends for large parties and gatherings. The Colorado Firefighters Calendar hold their annual fundraiser there. And during the summer, the building is open for farmers markets, street fairs, and even the X Games. And these new uses show us that gay spaces have fully entered mainstream culture. As we reach the present day, we can chart the shuttering of Denver's queer spaces, and many times the patrons simply consolidate them into a new space. But there's also a wider sense that many spaces in Denver are now welcoming to all. And so dark bars, which once served as the main arena for anonymous socialization, are now falling out of favor. And here are just two other examples of bars that existed in the early 2000s. The Denver Wrangler, RIP, and the Grand, both of which had a new method of displaying themselves to the public. They had wide open bars, they had big windows, they hosted beer busts, where the intent was to see and be seen rather than to stay shuttered and anonymous. I think the best example of this is the Triangle. And that really shows the evolution of the gay bar from the 1970s into the present. The original bar was a fortress to the outside world. There was minimal signage, and outside cues hid what was taking place inside the building. The windows had been bricked open, and patrons were greeted with solid doors. The bar operated from the late 1980s to the early 2000s and developed quite a seedy reputation. But the bar closed in the early 2000s, and the building was recently rehabilitated. The window openings were reconstructed with period-appropriate windows. 2 outside patios were built, and now the casual passerby is able to see deep into the building. So unlike the bars of the past, the corner of the structure was carved away, welcoming people into the bar and the restaurant. And their bars serve no longer as safeguards, protecting the community within and keeping the public out. Now, new design and lighting and general atmosphere are bringing about people into the community. So as we enter 2020, it feels like we're at a crossroads. Never before has the queer community been more in the public eye. Following the Obergefell decision of 2015, support for gay marriage is at an all-time high in this country, with over 70% of Americans in support. In 2019, Governor Polis was sworn in with his partner and children at his side. And yet our trans community is increasingly under attack. Following the election of Donald Trump in 2016, it became commonplace to wake up to tweets maligning the community or announcing policy changes that affected fundamental rights. And today we are seeing an increasing number of bills introduced and passed in this country that limit trans youth access to vital health care or even bathrooms. And while we have never been more aware of the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and the impact of systematic white supremacy that has had on our queer community. At the same time, we're seeing an unprecedented number of celebrities coming out and expressing their full selves. We just re-elected Colorado's first trans legislator. And Denver is home to one of the few surviving lesbian bars, Blush and Blue. And I just welcomed a new sports themed bar, the Tight Ends. So it's tempting to think of history as being a steady march forward of progress. And that would make our current circumstances feel really overwhelming and disheartening. However, I like to think of history as a river. one with boulders and rapids and eddies that push and pull at our lives, our politics, and our communities, and we move in many different directions. And so right now, it does feel like we're in an eddy, but if we all paddle together, we'll keep moving forward. So remember, call your politicians, tip your waitresses, and have a happy Pride.
Well, thank you very much, guys. That was fascinating. It looks like we have some time for questions, and I haven't checked. Do we have any questions in the chat? No questions. I do see lots of thanks, though. Yeah, if folks want to raise their hand if they'd like to ask a question, maybe I'll just prime the pump here a little bit. So, of course, DOTI provides infrastructure, transportation services, all of that for the city. And I think this presentation showed how, gosh, a lot of the stuff we work on and maintain and stuff like that can really be an important part of cultures and people's lives on there. How can we be more effective kind of allies and builders and maintainers to the gay community?
That's a great question. Kara, do you have thoughts?
I was going to say, yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that anything is immediately coming to mind. We do appreciate that we get to use Colfax well, not in the pandemic time, but that Colfax is really an integral part of the queer community, just as the spaces along it, as well as that it is our, route for Pride and for the Pride Parade. This is like the nicest June to have ever marched down Colfax, and we're not actually doing it physically, because there's been a lot of times I've been marching down and it's 90 some degrees on the pavement of Colfax. I mean, one of the things that I know that I appreciate, and I think this was initiated by Councilman Clark in along Broadway, is the rainbow colored crosswalks. I think is a really great thing that sort of makes you feel welcome in that community and in sort of the South Broadway area. And so I think that is something that I think is really touching when I drive past it or walk past it. I was like, I just feel like I'm welcome in that space.
I also think the recent initiatives we've done in the pandemic that have allowed sort of more open bar space outside and converting some of our streets to shared spaces, I think that does a lot to help the community feel like they can come together. And now that we're in a time where we want to be outside and we want to be seen and see our friends and take part in that life, I think that's one program that is really great in building that kind of community, especially in Cap Hill. So
Great. Mr. Sandos, I see a hand.
Yes, sir. First off, I want to thank you for the great work you've done on this presentation. It's a tremendous walk back down memory lane. My father ran with support for the gay community in 1975 after what had happened with council in 73. I was elected to the city council at large in 1990 and was there the night that Amendment 2 had passed and the variety of things that had happened in between. What I want to ask is the transition. So I look at the time frame, so many things that happened. Heck, back in college, I stocked groceries at King Soopers and 9th and Corona, which had, a very solid base for the gay, lesbian, transgendered community. But my wife was here for a minute and she heard you say the queer community. And not very long ago, if you used the word queer to describe the community, it was thought to be very negative. So help me to understand, as we've gone through these transitions, the acceptance of what people talk about or how they refer to the community, what is appropriate, what are still the areas that are taboo, that we want to make sure that we're not duplicating.
Well, I think that language morphs over time. Becca and I, we've been doing this for a while, and we've had a lot of discussions about the language that we use. And I would say, even since we started researching and presenting on this, we use the term queer as a way to reclaim it, as a word that had been a slur and, really rooted in homophobia. We started to use that word to identify, to reclaim it. And I would say, even over the last, 5 or 6 years, it's become much more accepted. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I think it affects each queer person differently, of like what language they use or don't use. If someone uses the word homosexual, I always assume it's, someone says, I have a homosexual friend. Really, that means they don't have any gay friends at all, because they don't even know what the language means. And it's so clinical. I have a friend who she refers and will only say the word lesbian. She identifies as lesbian, and she says it's really important for her to use that word, because she came of age in the late 70s and early 80s, where it was the gay community, and it was really gay men at the forefront. And to be called lesbian and have the Gay Coalition of Denver change to the Gay and Lesbian Center, to have that word reclaimed and be able to be identified, for her, that was really important. And so I think it depends on the person you are talking to, as to what word is appropriate. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I'll let Becca, I think she could looking to jump in.
And when in doubt, the LGBTQ community is great. Just go with that, But I think especially the younger generations, queer also encompasses a lot more. It's not just sexual orientation, it's also gender expression and identity. And so now that we're starting to explore those intersections, queer seems to be a better fit for a lot of us about what that means. But yeah, it definitely was a slur, and we have had people in the past, and that's why Kara has that little disclaimer at the beginning, because we do understand that it can be uncomfortable for some people to hear that word, and that we need to talk through about why we're using it and what it signifies, and if you need to opt out, you can.
Yeah, I just wanting to make sure that we're both appropriate, but for people in their 60s like me who watched life happen, you said it's almost shocking to hear some of the words that are now, comfortable, which I find to be a good thing. Because now, like you said, to reclaim it, to own it, to be able to be comfortable moving forward. There have been a lot of really hard times. My brother's partner in the very early 70s was shot and paralyzed coming out of a gay bar. Happened to walk out before my brother did, who was taking care of the bill. So we've seen a lot of terrible, very emotional times. And for this transition to be so more accepting and moving into a space, not where we need to be by any stretch, but significantly better and moving in the right direction. So I applaud your work. I thank you. And we had a great group of people participating from DOTI, which I was really, really pleased to see. And hope you get the same kind of support in other areas.
Thank you so much for having us. We appreciate it.
Yes, Kara, Becca, thank you very much for joining us, spending this hour with us. We host cultural events every month. Recognizes, I'm sure you do, we're public servants, and we want to understand our neighbors, the folks we're serving, and the history of that and how we got to where we are today. I think is a great way for folks to understand why things are and how we can improve things in the future. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. This was a fantastic presentation. I want to thank everyone else at DOTI who took the time out of their day to join us today. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Happy Pride.
Yeah.
Happy Pride, everybody. Thank you, everyone.